Thank you everyone for joining us here and mostly online for the people who are tuning in live. I'd like to now start our session on energy prices and fossil fuel subsidy and the window for action on this. So to kick us off today, I'd like to invite Minister Anne-Beat Trivenham, who is the Minister of International Development from Norway, to join us to deliver opening remarks. Minister?
Can I just sit here? Is
Yes,
that okay?
of course.
I'll sit where... Is it working? No. It's there's a light. Is this working?
Yeah.
No.
Test, test.
How about yours, Shamina?
Wait.
Always happens. No? So there's something... Mine is working. Now. Woo! Magic. Thank you. Now, dear everyone, we really are in a challenging time of mutually reinforcing crisis, and we need to just take advantage of all the possible available tools that there are to deal with climate crisis, galloping energy prices, fertilizer prices, growing deficit on food production, while at the same time, while all this is happening, fossil fuel subsidies have skyrocketed. So that's a backdrop that we are dealing with. According to the IEA, they nearly doubled in 2021 and are expected to increase further next year. And we all know the backdrop of the Russian war against Ukraine, how it has contributed to these peaking prices and the devastating effects on living conditions. But it also clearly obstructs the developing countries' abilities to reach their developing goals on poverty, on hunger, and it has a particular effect on SDG 12C, which has a clear goal and indicator on rationalizing inefficient fossil fuel subsidies and harmful subsidies. Now, government subsidies can help people overcome the instant challenges of the crisis that we are facing, and it's understandable on a shorter term. As a politician, I can relate to that. But we must together keep our focus on phasing out the inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, because in the longer run we all know the negative impacts related to several of the crises that we are facing, obviously especially climate and development. And we know that carefully designed reforms can have multiple positive effects, and let me just emphasize some fundamental aspects. First, if we do it right, reforms aimed at reducing fossil fuel subsidies can reduce poverty. Second, it creates space on public budgets, creating the space for investments in education, in health, in all the good things that we want going out there. And third, obviously, this is a no-brainer. It will reduce emissions. It will increase the use of clean energy. And fourth, putting a price on carbon is one effective way of encouraging low-emission investments, reinforcing subsidies reform at the same time. So fossil fuel subsidies is obviously the opposite of carbon pricing, which is one of the measures being promoted to fight global warming. Actually, Norway was one of the first countries in the world to introduce carbon tax. We're very proud of that. And what we saw is that spurred investments in renewables. It really did. and in energy efficient solutions. So it works. And we see that it made our companies more competitive globally. We can document that. The SDGs, as we know, are universal, and the implementation of the SDGs is a national responsibility, which obviously includes Goal 12C on subsidies. But we do need the international cooperation to deliver on it anyway. Norway is a firm supporter of fossil fuel subsidies reform at the WTO. The first meeting on reform was held in October this year. So far, that initiative has 47 WTO members. It focuses on advancing discussions to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption. And also let me mention that Norway takes part in the negotiations on an agreement on climate, trade and sustainability, the ACCTS. We work together with New Zealand, Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland and Switzerland. And the aim is to establish disciplines to eliminate harmful subsidies. The International Institute of Sustainable Development, the IISD, has been a persistent partner for Norway and our international cooperation for getting the improved data analysis, the methodology that we need on estimation of fossil fuel subsidies. And for me as a mere politician and political scientist, it is it's really difficult to get into the nitty-gritty of those calculations. So that kind of groundbreaking work on methodology is absolutely essential. The objective is to contribute to a gradual transition on global energy systems from fossil to renewable. In the period of 2009 to 2024, Norway's financial support to Global Subsidies Initiative is around 4.5 million euro. And furthermore, we will continue our diplomatic efforts together with other members of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, FFSR, to approach other countries and organizations. And we must keep up the pressure for implementing the ambitions formulated by the G20, APEC and G7. And many of these countries are key to achieve the potential massive global gains of reducing these subsidies. I believe that the Friends Group should maintain a sharp focus on the country's industries and forms of energies that produce the largest amount of CO2 emissions because of fossil fuel subsidies. We'll start with the long-hanging fruits. And the coal industry should be a main target. According to estimates, consumer subsidies accounts for more than 80% of the global fossil fuel subsidies. Therefore, consumer subsidies should also be a main focus for the reforms. However, we should also include emphasis on production subsidies where they exist. There is too little attention on and assistance to phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. This is a niche, the niche that the FFSR should concentrate on. Now, the UNDP's very bold global campaign, I must say, which is, the largest and most robust in UN history, at least according to UNDP, and I trust you on that, to raise attention to fossil fuel subsidies has been most welcome. Norway supports it wholeheartedly. And the COPs are also important arenas for enhanced attention to the negative effects of the subsidies in questions. And we have to turn every stone in our endeavors. We value our partnership. I think we know what to do. We need more hands on deck. And thank you for giving me the floor. And I hope and trust this will be a very useful compensation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Minister. I know you have other deliberations to get to, so thank you. And I'd like to now kick us off with a virtual opening remarks from UNDP's Assistant Administrator Usha Rao Manari, and I'd like her to, her virtual remarks will be coming online now.
Distinguished guests, I'm pleased to join you virtually for this critical conversation about energy prices and fossil fuel subsidy reform. As the global landscape shifts, the interconnectedness of climate, energy, and development has never been more critical. The current global crises have underscored the tension between immediate development needs and climate and energy transitions. Fossil fuels are the primary cause of human-induced climate change, causing pollution and premature death, and leading to other negative externalities such as urban congestion and biodiversity loss. Fossil fuel subsidies are often intended to protect the poor, but most subsidy benefits tend to be captured by higher income households, exacerbating inequality. Governments facing fiscal constraints by providing fossil fuel subsidies may also deter investments in the energy transition to sustainable energy sources. The current geopolitical and energy crisis context has stalled progress on fossil fuel subsidy reform. Despite fossil fuel subsidies undermining the credibility of public climate commitments, reducing perceived energy transition risks and limiting financial sector action, governments are using tax breaks, price caps, and other measures to help consumers cope with the surging energy prices. Globally, energy prices have soared and added to the considerable challenges many developing countries face. In an attempt to support vulnerable populations, governments have resorted to blanket subsidies which further exacerbate the fiscal imbalance of fragile economies. Many countries are currently undergoing an economic crisis. If left unaddressed, the continuation of these policies will deter the achievement of global climate goals and reverse human development. UNDP's Sustainable Energy Hub has helped develop high-level policy guidance to policymakers on how to effectively tackle energy crises while leaving no one behind. With these recommendations, UNDP stands ready to support countries to get on track to meet their climate ambitions and energy transition goals, while ensuring that the energy crisis does not derail progress on sustainable human development. I would like to thank our partners at IISD and the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform for joining us to convene this important dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to welcome our panelists. Let me make room for them. I'd like to call on Minister Kanchana Vijayasekara, who is the Minister of Power and Energy from Sri Lanka. Welcome. Join us. And Jan Wahlberg, the Ambassador of Climate Change from Finland. Simon Black, Climate Economist from IMF. And Philip Gass, Energy Transition Lead from IISD. Thank you all for joining us today. I think that we'll have to share a microphone. I hope you're okay with that. So, Minister Vijayasekara, I'll start with the first question to you. Earlier this year, Sri Lanka grappled with the fuel shortage crisis, combined with one of the worst economic crises the country has faced in more than 70 years. This meant the rising energy prices were top of mind for everyone in the country, including the government. Could you share how you managed to implement energy pricing reforms and share some sort of key lessons learned from that process?
One of the first things that we managed to do in the last 6 months is to cut down all the subsidies that were given for petroleum product usage in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, for the last so many decades, 7 decades, more than that, we had subsidized fossil fuel, power sector, energy sector, everything was subsidized. But we managed to cut down the entire amount of subsidies that were given to the public for use of fossil fuel. which meant two things. One was we were facing economic crisis, which we are still battling. That meant that our energy bill, what we import, was drastically reduced by 40% for the last 6 months. The management system meant another thing, that the usage of fossil fuel by the public became much less with the subsidies being taken out. And we've seen that over the last 6 months, even with the small quantities that we've imported to the country, we've managed to keep the businesses going, we've managed to keep the agriculture sector going, we've managed to keep the health sector going, we managed to keep the power sector going. So all these have been managed with a management of a fuel system, guaranteeing a quota of fuel every week for the public, but also making sure that there's enough fuel available for food security, for agriculture, fisheries, and those sort of things. And also another thing that we've done in the last 6 months is, with the new president in charge of the Sri Lanka government right now, what we managed to do is restructure the energy and the power sectors. The power and the energy sectors both have been monopolies of the government. So we've opened it up for the private sector to be stakeholders, and also looking at an energy mix, which we committed to in COP26, 70-30 renewable energy goals by 2030. I would say which we have achieved 70% renewable energy generation in our energy mix, even in 2022. So we hope to be committed to our policies of 70-30 renewable energy transition by 2030. We've cut down on most of the thermal power plants that we've been using. We've used more hydro, we've used more renewable energy, we've used more wind, we've used more solar facilities, and the government has also introduced new incentives for new developers who are willing to develop into solar and the wind capability that we do have. The other area that we're looking at right now in Sri Lanka is looking into the future. What we've seen in the last 6 months is, with the cut down on fossil fuel, it's something that's achievable. It's something achievable with going more into renewable energy, which has an immense potential in Sri Lanka. But the challenges that we do face is the potential that we do possess exceeds our requirements. So what are we going to do with the excess amounts of energy that we produce in terms of solar, in terms of offshore wind, in terms of green hydrogen? So we are discussing with the Indian government as well for a grid connectivity, so which we will look into the future, maybe export or share energy. And we want to be a country where we are energy independent. Right now we spend about $600 million monthly on energy import bills, but we've reduced that drastically over the last few months, and we hope to head in that same direction. And also the legal framework and the policies that we've been speaking about for decades, we managed to speed through them, implement them with the crisis in hand. So I see this crisis as an opportunity for Sri Lanka to achieve its energy targets, but we do need the assistance, the technical assistance and the financial assistance of developed countries. Though we don't contribute immensely into carbon emissions in the world, we're still a country that doesn't depend too much on fossil fuel, but we do need the technical assistance and the financial assistance needed for local developers or even developers from other countries to come and use the potentials that we do have to offer in Sri Lanka. So with that, we hope we could be an energy hub that shares our energy exports with the regional countries. The other challenge that we've had with the energy prices subsidies that we've cut down is that we are still a country that depends on about 1/3 from export income. That's where our main foreign income comes from. So once we have cut down all the subsidies, it's very difficult for a country like us to compete with neighboring regional countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, who are also in the same trade of exporting apparels, maybe agricultural products. So we need to keep in line with that as well. So it has had drawbacks on our export income, but we are committed to seeing it through. We are committed to seeing the no new coal policy through. So the only power plant with our coal supply, we are hoping to decommission it by 2030, 2035. So we are committed to those goals, and with the new policy and the legal framework being implemented, we hope that we can be an energy independent country.
Thank you, Minister. Ambassador Wahlberg, my next question is to you. Finland has been a member of fossil fuel subsidy reform for several years. How do you see the perception of fossil fuel subsidies change over the last few decades, especially in the past year? And what role can the Friends Group collectively and Finland individually play in promoting fossil fuel subsidy reform during this energy crisis?
Thank you very much, and it's good to be here and talk from the Nordic climate ambassador perspective. Both ministers, I think they have laid out the scene very well. I would start by saying in a way that, like Norway also, we have been front runners in the domestic policies, both on taxation, on carbon pricing and on energy taxation. So I think that kind of enables us and also obliges us to take it to our foreign policy, to our development policy, and to our trade policy, and be kind of leaders in building structures. And that's why we have been very proud to be part of the fossil fuel subsidies reforms, friends. I think you mentioned also on the longer perspective, but also this year there has been quite a dramatic change in how we perceive fossil fuel subsidies in general, and the fossil fuels. It's because of the war in Ukraine, and I think it's you said it well, Minister, also that we have to see this also as an opportunity, because we are in a way, especially in Europe, we are obliged to do the trust transition from fossils to renewables, and we need to do it. So take it as an opportunity, because it's will be accelerating the processes, and it's more urgent than ever to do the job. It's not directly related to the subsidies, but also I think all the just energy transition partnerships we had with South Africa last year, and we are doing now with Vietnam and Indonesia. We need more kind of energy transition partnerships, and that's key also for the structural reform, because I think the major problem we see with the fossil fuel subsidies, they kind of embed and lock in wrong kind of structures, because we are continuing with, we are not making the frog leap to the low cost and circular economy transition. So in a way that impedes us also from the new bioeconomy, renewables. So what we need to do, actually, you mentioned it also, we need more climate finance and we need more development finance, but not for fossil fuels. We need it for other things and other projects. The Norwegian minister talked quite a lot about WTO. I think it's a very important fora also. And I would just mention ministerial statement from June, where we started the dialogue on this process. And I think it's also, like I said, it's a part of foreign policy, it's part of development policy, but also I think very much so that we need to continue the process in the WTO fora. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. I think that, Ambassador, the point that you made about carbon lock-in is a key thing. And Minister, you mentioned that as well. So climate finance is definitely critical. So our next speaker is Simon. And for you, Simon, IMF has long advocated for getting fossil fuel prices right to reflect both the supply costs and the environmental costs. Could you shed some insights on IMF's analytical work on governments with fossil fuel subsidy reform in times when energy prices are increasing and energy security remains a concern?
Sure, thank you for the question. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. So firstly, I want to talk a bit about concepts. So when we talk about fossil fuel subsidies in the IMF, we do talk about the direct financial transfers to producers and consumers of fossil fuels, which we call the explicit fossil fuel subsidies. Our latest update and our latest numbers was done last year, before the recent surge in energy prices. but that estimate put it at about $500 billion globally, which is a pretty large chunk of change when you consider the climate finance target's 100 billion, right? So that's a lot. But even more significant are the social costs, the externalities. We know that polluters are not paying for all of the costs of their consumption of fossil fuels. A large portion of that is, of course, climate damages, which is, of course, why we're all here today. But there are other externalities as well, such as the local air pollution costs. Local air pollution kills about 7 to 12 million people a year. The vast majority of those are in developing countries. We at the fund believe the majority of those people are actually the poor in developing countries. So it's a big development problem, not just a climate problem. So when you quantify and value those other externalities, we get to an even bigger figure by an order of magnitude of about 5.5 trillion, right? So when we add the 5.5 trillion to the 500 billion, we get 6 trillion globally in terms of total fossil fuel subsidies, which is about 7% of GDP. And as our managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, made clear in one of her talks last week, this is madness. We should not be doing this. We need to reform these fossil fuel subsidies, and instead, I'm afraid we're actually going in the opposite direction because of recent events. So what's happening right now is the governments are rushing to suppress the price increases of fuels globally. We've been very vocal about this being not the desirable policy approach to take. Countries are understandably worried about the impact of rising energy prices on the poor. But if your objective is to protect the vulnerable, one of the worst policies you could do is suppress the prices of fuels. We know the vast majority of the benefit from fossil fuel subsidies goes to the richest deciles, the richest households. And so what we propose, and additionally, if you suppress energy prices, then you increase energy demand, which makes the problem worse and could stoke risks of fuel rationing and so on. So what we propose instead within the IMF is to the extent that you're worried about vulnerable households, compensate them directly through fiscal transfers, through labor tax reductions where possible, and second best, but still an option, is to do block tariff reductions so that you have, so it's cheaper for the first initial use of, say, electricity in the case of electricity and so on. So that's where we've got to, and unfortunately where we're going. But we're still trying to make that message very, very clear that you should not be suppressing the prices of fuels, but you should be doing these direct transfers to vulnerable households. So where are we going? So moving forward, the picture looks a bit grim right now, admittedly, but our central estimates do have fossil fuel prices declining in coming years. And we think that decline presents an opportunity to reform these fossil fuel subsidies by putting effectively a floor on the fall in the prices of fuels, especially coal and natural gas, which are of course the most polluting, and to a lesser extent gasoline and diesel, which could fall somewhat below recently experienced levels. And the way you do that is through fossil fuel subsidy reform, as well as through explicit carbon pricing, carbon taxes, ETSs, energy taxes, and so on. And if countries are able to do that, then they'll reap a fiscal benefit, which is a huge issue right now, which can be used for ensuring fiscal sustainability or used for investments in other SDGs, not just the one that we're here to discuss. And then finally, how can governments do that? Do we have examples? Well, we've got lots of examples of countries that have successfully reformed their fossil fuel subsidies. We've written about this extensively over the last decade in the IMF. IISD and World Bank and other colleagues have written, and UNDP have written on this as well. So I won't go into all those examples, but I do want to pick out two which I find interesting, which is specifically the reform in Iran in 2008 and more recently in Saudi Arabia in 2016 and 18. And what both those countries did, or what Iran did specifically, is they created millions of frozen bank accounts for all the citizens of Iran. And the citizens were told, we're going to increase fossil fuel prices, in some cases by 4 times, on this date in the future. But hey, here's a bank account which has your name and your details on it, which will be unfrozen on the day of the reform. And if the reform doesn't go ahead, you don't get that money. And so you might you might be unsurprised. You might not be surprised to find that this reform was quite popular, right? Because people were expecting this cash transfer, even though there was a huge surge in energy prices virtually overnight. So we think there are ways of doing this, and increasingly countries and governments will be in a space where they can think about doing these things. So I'm overall optimistic, despite the grim picture that we currently face.
Thank you, Simon. I just one number, Simon had lots of stats that he shared, but I just want to say that I hope you paid attention that the cost of climate finance that was committed 100 billion, and then the cost of fossil fuel subsidies without accounting for externalities, which is 500 billion. So we just need 1/5 of that money that's what countries are asking for today at COP. So that stood out to me in that number. So over to Philip next. Philip, with the energy crisis context, what are some trends in fossil fuel subsidies you've seen over the last year, and what new challenges have emerged as you've been leading the work in this space, and what opportunities can help drive subsidy reforms for countries and actors who haven't sort of taken that up yet?
Sure. Before I start, just first to thank you, UNDP, for hosting this event, and the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform and the other members of the speakers group as well, for their commitment to this issue. And I'll get back to it, but that sort of transparency and commitment is a big part of what we need right now. I mean, it's no secret, subsidies are up. We came out of a situation with COVID where we at ISD, through the Energy Policy Tracker, tracked the millions of dollars that went into recovery packages, and the large percentage of that went to fossil fuels, which is unfortunate, but is reality, and it's something that we're facing with. Now with energy pricing crisis, the energy price crisis, we're seeing it again. So it's not the easiest time for fossil fuel subsidy reform, but that's what makes it so important as well. Prices are going up in many places at rates higher than inflation, which also drives challenges for issues like food, not just energy security, but food security as well. We see it in petrol prices. We've seen it in Europe with natural gas prices. And not just prices going up, but the potential for supply being constrained and the need for energy rationing, which creates a lot of pressure on consumers and a lot of pressure for governments to alleviate the pressure on consumers, which is valid. We're also in the midst of a potential food crisis as well, where events like the war in Ukraine have constricted food security. And as a result, the need to secure food production everywhere else is at the forefront. And in a lot of places there are subsidies for agricultural production, for fuel that's sold at reduced or zero tax rates. And so it's a reality that these subsidies are here. So as an organization that works on fossil fuel subsidy reform, how do we wrestle with this? I think that what we realize is that in a short term, access and security trump all. And that's important. And we recognize that there are cases where very important social goals may have to be achieved in the short term through a fossil fuel subsidy. But it's important that subsidy is very limited, that it's regularly reviewed, that it's judged to be the only alternative, and that you're not hindering long-term low-carbon development. Like, we don't want to see subsidies for new coal plants that are going to last 40 years. That's not helpful. A subsidy to alleviate an energy consumer, we can see a rationale for that. If you're in a very cold climate where the temperature is below zero for a long time of the year, and you're unable to pay your heating bills, we understand that that's a real social impact and a social pressure. So we're sympathetic to the situation and realize that some of these subsidies might be necessary. With that said, there are some opportunities. Countries are accelerating transition at much faster rates. We've seen acceleration under the Fit 55 plan in the EU to accelerate solar and wind power installation, to accelerate solar heat pump installation, and greatly expand renewables. And part of that is that shifting of investment from fossil fuels to clean energy. And that's part of ensuring energy prices are right as well, because fossil fuel subsidies have the potential to distort the market. So if that market is distorted, it's important that a return to market competitiveness is achieved as quickly as possible so that the renewables are the long-term answer. And increasingly, energy security is seen as locally produced renewable energy generation. And that's a big part of it as well. We recognize that certainly there's no simple solution, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to fossil fuel subsidy reform or low-carbon transition. And that's part of a need to really examine these issues from a social perspective and from an economic perspective. One other thing I'll lead to that we've got now that we didn't have before was we're here talking about these issues. 10, 15 years ago, the issue of fossil fuel subsidy reform wasn't nearly highlighted at the level it is now at events like this. We've got multiple governments recognizing that fossil fuel subsidy reform is critical, is important. We've got organizations like UNDP and IMF and ourselves looking to quantify those subsidies and transparently report them. And people aren't shying away from the knowing that these subsidies have to be reformed in the long term. We've also got tools like the SDG indicator 12C1 that help us coherently and transparently communicate on subsidies and ensure that that everybody is speaking the same language, and that this relates to things like G20 peer review as well. A colleague of mine in the audience has an event at 3:15 at the SDG Pavilion to talk about quantification of subsidies and how it's getting easier and better through the use of SDG indicators. So the opportunities I see are through a recognition that this problem is real. We can't hide from it. We need to address it. The opportunities that we've got tools like the SDG indicator to help quantify, and we've got a general consensus that the long-term solution isn't subsidized fossil fuels, it's low-carbon energy transition. And so if fossil fuel subsidies are in place, we have to, there's a commitment and a general understanding that they have to be reformed. It maybe can't be done today, but we have timelines in place and we're looking to accelerate those. And the higher energy prices get, the more that the pressure for change, as higher prices get higher, there's more pressure for subsidies. There's also more momentum for reform to ensure that we aren't in this crisis in another 2 years or another 3 years for the same reason. So that's sort of our take on it, and I'll maybe leave it at that.
Thank you. So, building on the last point you said in terms of momentum and building momentum, right? This is a question I'm going to pose to all of you, so whoever wants to sort of go first can go. What is the best narrative to build that momentum, right? How can governments, how can they communicate about fossil fuel subsidies at a time when energy prices are increasing and energy security remains a concern? Like, what is the best narrative to build that momentum and that buy-in from the general sort of population? Who wants to go first?
Well, maybe I'll just really briefly and then I'll pass down the line. I think for us, what we're doing here today helps. We've got governments coming forward saying, we've done this, you can do it too. And also through diplomatic measures and with the support of other organizations, understanding that there is a process. There's G20 peer reviews, there's APEC peer reviews. Civil society organizations have been, and expert organizations like IMF have been invited in transparent discussions and using tools like 12C1 to ensure we're all speaking the same language. So there is a good deal of momentum, and I think as we are dealing with these high energy prices, there's more of an appetite to say, well, what else is out there and how can we reform this? And in reality, the tools are there. There are countries that have led, and there's an opportunity to communicate that more broadly. So I would just say more and increasing the types of discussions we've had through organizations like G20 and APEC.
Yeah, I mean, I would associate myself with everything he said. I think for me, communication is key, not just at a sort of international level to ensure we're speaking the same language, but when it comes to actually reforming the subsidies to your domestic population. One of the key lessons that we have from many years now of fossil fuel subsidy reform, as well as carbon pricing, by the way. I wouldn't separate the two so explicitly. There's nothing special about zero, is what I keep saying. When you go from removing a subsidy to increasing a tax, it's equivalent in terms of energy prices and so on, and revenues and economic impacts. But the key lesson really is it's not so much what you do, it's how you do it and how you communicate with your domestic populations. The countries that have faced backlashes from fossil fuel subsidy reform are those that tend to have done them instantaneously, overnight, without consultation, and it's been a huge surprise to the population, and that's where we see the protests. The ones that the success stories, which we often don't hear about in the news because they're less splashy and interesting, the countries that have reformed them successfully have done so through an inclusive process that includes NGOs, includes key stakeholders, and really raises energy prices in a clear, consistent, and graduated way that gives firms and households time to actually shift their investment and their behavioral patterns to adjust to the new normal.
I think the best narrative has come up a little bit already today. It's that fossil fuel subsidies, they are not a measure for welfare. There are other measures for that. You mentioned it, I think also that it's kind of the middle income and higher income people who benefit more. So to get that message through, that it's because I think people don't understand. They think that this is to the benefit of the most needed, but that's not really the case. So kind of make the case that we need other kind of welfare measures, not fossil fuel subsidies.
Yeah, I would agree with everyone, and I would say from the experience that we've had in removing most of the subsidies that's attributed to fossil fuels, one thing was to communicate and to be transparent. To be transparent about the pricing mechanisms and the import prices was very vital for us to communicate to the public why we need to take off the subsidies. And also, I think every country needs to take into this consideration also about discussing about going into the future. There should be discussions on energy caps as well, on pricing as well. So that would help countries that are transitioning in a transition to achieve its goals as well.
Thank you very much. So that actually brings our panel to a conclusion. I want to thank Minister, Ambassador Simon Philip, for all of you for being here and joining us today, and for all of you for joining us here at COP, and for those tuning in live. And you know, this conversation is going to be something that's ongoing. I think that we'll hear this at COP. And UNDP Sustainable Energy Hub has published a set of high-level policy recommendations aimed at policymakers to support their work on, you know, addressing energy price issues in consideration to fossil fuel subsidy reform. And you can find that at undp.org/energy. So thank you, and that's all for now.
Yeah,